Hello, everybody. In this video, we are going to do the market research question from the LP in marketing handout. It's a very common sort of a problem that market researchers have to face. That is, who do they go and talk to? So let's take a look at this question. Market Survey Inc. specializes in evaluating market reactions to new products, services, and advertising campaigns. The client firm requested MSI's assistance in ascertaining customer reaction to a recently marketed household product, right? So during the meeting, MSI has agreed to do many door-to-door personal interviews, and they will do responses from households that have children and households that don't have children. These are common parameters that companies would like to know. So is there a difference between what are the variables for which you'd like to gather data? One of the variables that they want to gather data about is households with children, households without children. The other one is doing interviews during the day and evenings, because people work and sometimes they may not be available during the day and so on. And so that's the idea here. So they have to conduct 1,000 interviews with the following quota guidelines. The first one is that the interview, they have to interview at least 400 households with children. They have to interview at least 400 households without children. The total number of households interviewed during the evening must be at least as great as the number of households interviewed during the day. So they have to interview just as many households in the evening as they're done in the day. And at least 40% of the interviews must be for households with children, or for households with children must be conducted in the evening. And at least 60% of the interviews for households without children must be conducted during the evening, right? So because the interviews for households with children take additional interviewer time, and because evening interviews are paid more than daytime interviewers, the cost varies. These are the cost values. So based upon this, we have to formulate a linear programming problem and solve it to figure out how many interviews are we conducting for this particular client, right? So that's the problem here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up a PowerPoint file, and let's start writing stuff up, right? Okay. So first, let's begin with the decision variables. As usual, step one is always decision variables. Right. So in this case, what are the decision variables? So you have to interview households with children, you have to interview households without children. You can conduct these interviews during the day, and you can conduct these interviews during the evening. So there are two different dimensions for the kind of interviews that you can conduct. There is the daytime evening time dimension, and there's also the with children, households with children, households without children dimension. So essentially, we'll have 4 decision variables here, right? So the variables, I'm going to call them DC. So this is the number DC, DNC, then EC, and ENC. Right? So you know what? Just two that's enough. DCDN, ECEN. Okay. So these are going to be our 4 decision variables. The first one is going to be the number of interviews of households with children conducted during the day, during daytime, right? So that's DC. Similarly, we can say DN is the number of interviews of households without children conducted during daytime. And similarly, EC will be number of interviews of households with children conducted during evening time. Children without children. Right, so these are the 4 types of interviews that we have to keep track of, and these are the 4 decision variables that we have. Of course, the objective is to minimize total cost. So that's our objective. Step 2, minimize total cost. And what are the cost values? Let me do. Okay. Minimize 20 times DC, because that's the cost of conducting a daytime interview for households with children, plus 25 times DN, that's the most expensive interview, plus 18 times EN. Right. So this is EC, right? I'm sorry. That's EC. So actually, we are doing DC, DN, EC, EN. So DC, DN, daytime, no children will be 18. So let's do 18 times. The order really doesn't matter. Just when I'm putting it into Excel, I just want it to be in the same order as here, DC, DN, EC, EN. Then EC will be 25 plus EN will be 20, right? So DC, DN, EC, EN. That's our objective. Minimize the total cost of conducting all of these interviews, right? Okay. Now let's write the constraints. First of all, the first constraint is that you have to conduct at least 1,000 interviews, if I remember correctly. So the first is, yes, you have to conduct 1,000 interviews. So we can say at least 1,000 interviews. We don't want to do exactly 1,000. You could potentially do more, but because this is cost minimization, we'll probably end up doing exactly 1,000. So I'm going to say the total number of interviews, which is DC plus DN plus EC plus EN, is greater than or equal to 1,000. I'm going to leave the option open. They can potentially do more than 1,000, but again, like I said, because it's cost minimization, they'll probably end up doing exactly 1,000. Right, that's the first constraint. The next constraint is you have to do at least 400 interviews of households with children and 400 interviews of households without children, right? So let's write that constraint. So 400 interviews for households with children. If the total number of interviews of households with children are the daytime interviews plus evening time interviews of households with children, this has to be at least 400. Similarly, without children, so it's DN plus EN has to be at least 400, right? Now, apart from that, you also have other constraints. The next constraint is the total number of interviews interviewed in the evening must be at least as great as the number of interviews during the day. So you have to interview equal or more people in the evening. So it says the total number of interviews in the evening, DN plus EN, has to be at least as great as or greater than or equal to number of interviews during the day. So that'll be, I'm sorry, I messed up. So that should be the evening interviews, right? So that should be EC plus EN is greater than DC plus DN. Right. I mistake that. All right, next. At least 40% of the interviews for households with children must be conducted during the evening. So 40% of interviews of households with children must be conducted in the evening at least. So number of interviews conducted in the evening for households with children, right? For households with children. So this should be at least 40% of the total number of interviews of households with children, which will be DC plus EC. All right. So let's go over this statement and the constraint again. It says at least 40% of interviews for households with children. So you're just looking at interviews for households with children. 40% of, at least 40% of them must be done during the evening. So this is the total number of interviews for households with children, both during daytime and evening time. So 40% of this, right, has to be done in the evening, at least 40% of this. So it can be more than that. It could be 50%, 60%, 70%. So that's why you're saying it is greater than or equal to 0.4 times that. Now, you cannot say that DC plus EC is 400 because you don't know. You're saying that DC plus EC has to be greater than or equal to 400. It could be 450 or 500. If it is 500, at least 40% of that must be conducted in the evening. If it is 600, at least 40% of them must be conducted in the evening. So you don't know what that number is. That's why you're going to say DC plus EC here, right? I'm obviously going to rewrite these equations once I finish them so that I have all my variables on the left-hand side. We'll do that math in a second, but let's finish the constraints first. Excuse me. Right. Now, at least 60% of interviews for households without children must be conducted in the evening, right? So similarly, the number of evening interviews for households without children, at least 60% should be at least 60% of the total number of interviews for households without children, either during the day or in the evening. So this is the total number of interviews that you conduct for households without children. At least 60% of them must be done in the evening, right? So those are the constraints. Let's see, blah, 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 blah. Door-to-door personal interviews. Okay, that's it. So these are all our constraints. Now this, like I said, I'm going to rewrite a few of these. The last three I'm going to rewrite because I want all variables on one side. So I'm going to say this I'm going to rewrite as EC plus EN minus DC minus DN is greater than or equal to 0. So I've moved both of these variables to the left hand side. So EC plus EN minus DC minus DN is greater than or equal to 0. Similarly, I'm going to distribute the 0.4. So there are a couple of steps here, but I'm going to go through the step. I'm going to write the final answer. You can do the algebra yourself. It's pretty straightforward. So it's 0.4 times DC plus 0.4 times EC. When I move this to the other side of the inequality, just like if I subtract it on both sides of the inequality, we are going to have minus 4 times DC on the left hand side, but also you have EC minus 0.4 times EC. So there'll be 0.6 times EC minus 0.4 times DC is greater than or equal to 0. So the algebra, so I skipped a step in between. You can do the steps yourself. Just distribute the 0.4 into it and move everything to the left hand side. You'll end up with this equation, this inequality. Similarly, this inequality here, again, I'm going to distribute the 0.6, move everything to the left hand side. I'm going to get 0.4 times EN minus 0.6 times DN is greater than or equal to 0. So these are the constraints. So I have 6 constraints. All of them are greater than or equal to constraints, and this is what we have. Okay, these are really bad today. Right. So these are the 6 constraints right here. There you go. All right. So I'm going to put these constraints into Excel and we're going to solve them. Okay, so marketing, market research. Market research. So we'll make all the fonts bigger so we can see this clearly. Right? DC, DN, EC, and EN. Right? Those are the 4 decision variables. Okay, and the objective, right. Objective is 20 times DC, 80 times DN, 25 times EC, and 20 times EN, right? So, oh, we also have the left hand side and right hand side here. Let me not forget that. That's the objective. Let's write the constraints. Total interviews. Total number of interviews have to be at least 1000. Next is DC plus EC is greater than 400. Next is DN plus EN is greater than 400. It's at least 400 daytime, at least, oh, not daytime, at least 400 with children. Interviews for households with children, at least 400 no children, right? Then you need more in the evening. The number of interviews, total number of interviews in the evening have to be at least as high as the number of interviews in the morning. So that is EC plus EN minus DC minus DN. So minus DC minus DN plus EC plus EN is greater than or equal to 0. And then you have the 40% constraint and then the 60% constraint. Okay, so the 40% constraint is 0.6 EC minus 0.4 DC. It's 0.6 EC minus 0.4 DC is greater than or equal to 0. And the other one is 0.4 EN minus 0.6 DN. Minus 0.6 DN is greater than or equal to 0. Right? So those are all our constraints in there. So let's put them into the solver and solve it. So data, solver, right? The objective, oh, oops, forgot to write all the sum product functions. So let's write the sum product functions. So sum product of the coefficients, comma, the decision variables. For the decision variables, we're going to make them all absolute references to be able to copy the formulas down, make our lives easier. Okay, now we go to the solver. The objective is right there. The objective is to minimize total cost. These are all the changing variables. And I'm just going to add one constraint because all constraints are greater than or equal to constraints. It's going to choose all the left hand sides. They have to be greater than or equal to all the right hand side values. So all the left hand sides have to be greater than all the right hand sides, going from F6 to F11, greater than H6 to H11, and the objective is in F4. And your objective is to minimize total cost. So I'm just going to solve. This should give us an answer. Now again, we are not explicitly imposing the condition that the variables have to be integers, but as you see, the variables will turn out to be integers, and this is how we are going to conduct our operations. Now, the minimum possible cost is 20,320. You cannot do this for less than 20,320, right? And then you have the 4 decision. These are the values of the decision variable. That is, conduct 240 interviews in daytime for households. In the daytime for households with children, 240 interviews in the daytime for households without children, 160 interviews in the evening time for households with children, 360 interviews for households without children in the evening, right? That is that's the final solution, right? And that's how you do the market research question in the LP in marketing. Right? Take care.